Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Last time I casually mentioned that guests will build up their intensity tolerance over time, and I got quite a few comments that were like, wait, what? That's a thing? Yeah, it very much is. So in this video I will explain exactly how the intensity and nausea preferences of the guests work and how it can change over time. When you click on a guest and check their stats tab, it will tell you their preferred ride intensity with numbers and the nausea tolerance with a more vague one-word description. This guest has an intensity preference of between 3 and 6 and a high nausea tolerance, while this other guest will ride anything with over 4 intensity but only has an average nausea tolerance. How the intensity preference works seems pretty clear. Just compare the intensity rating of the ride to the preference of the guest and you will see whether they will ride it or not. Seems easy, but then you realize that Greta Thunberg is currently going on a ride with nearly 8 intensity, while her preference is only between 3 and 6. And here we have David Beckham, who is a gentle soul and prefers gentler rides with less than 3 intensity, yet he is going on a big fat roller coaster with 9.97 intensity. What's going on here? Do these preferences even mean anything at all? Yeah, they do mean something, but it's not quite as simple as these numbers suggest. When a guest considers heading for a ride or randomly bumps into the queue line of a ride, they will do a check to see if the ride is within their preferred intensity rating. This is determined by their listed preference, plus an extension depending on their happiness. Greta Thunberg is super happy to be in my theme park and has the maximum happiness of 255. Therefore, the minimum intensity that she will go on is 3 minus 2.55 and the maximum is 6 plus 2.55. This gives her a range of 0.45 to 8.55, which is quite large and will cover most rides. The less happy your guests are, the smaller this extension. At half happiness, also known as the great neutrality, the minimum and maximum go down and up by 1.28 points, and if the guest is the most pissed off possible, it will not be extended at all as their happiness is 0. Some guests will have an intensity preference with a crazy high ceiling, such as between 2 and 14, or one that doesn't even seem to have a ceiling at all, like more than 4. This seems to indicate that they would go on some crazy intense ride with like 14, 15 or even 16 intensity, but alas, the maximum is actually capped at 10 for this calculation. This is before the happiness is added though, so taking that into account, the absolute highest intensity guests will ever go on is 12.55. There's also a nausea check that works in a similar way. First we need to know what the words that describe the nausea tolerance actually mean. There are 4 of them. None, low, average and high, and they really just stand for ranges, similar to the intensity. None means between 0 and 3, low means between 0 and 6, average is between 2 and 8, and high is between 4 and 10. The nausea check itself works the exact same, with happiness extending the range up to 2.55 points, except that there is no check for the minimum. The minimums of 2 and 4 that guests with average and high tolerances have are used for the satisfaction they get from the ride, but not at all for deciding whether they want to ride it in the first place. So for this video you can really just see these 4 tolerances as meaning up to 3, 6, 8 and 10 nausea, plus the happiness extension that adds another 0 to 2.55 points. This means that the highest possible nausea that the guests will tolerate is similar to the intensity rating 12.55. If both of these checks pass, and all the other ones related to other things as well, then the guest will enter the queue line if they randomly stumbled upon the ride, or they will start heading for the ride if they were only thinking about going on it. That still leaves one scenario remaining, and that is when, after the guest has decided to head for the ride, they find it and are about to enter the queue line. In theory, there should be no more checks necessary, as those checks already happened when deciding which ride to head for, but there is still one anyway, and that makes it a bit weird. At this point there is one simple check, and that is whether the intensity rating of the ride is 10 or less. Sounds simple enough, right? But it can lead to weird situations. For example, here we have a bunch of guests all heading for this big coaster, but when they get to the queue line they recoil in fear and head back the other way. That's already a bit odd, but what's even odder is that when they return to it a little later they suddenly do want to go on the ride and it's no longer too intense. What happened here is the following. When they decided to head for this ride, they checked the intensity of it, which is roughly 11. That's extremely high, but since the guests are quite happy, it did fall within their preferred range, so they decided to head for it. There was also a nausea check, but that wasn't a problem. However, when they got to the queue line, the game checked if the ride intensity was 10 or less, which it is not, so now they suddenly find it too intense. But when they come back to the queue line later, they are now just walking around randomly without a destination. With this random stumbling upon the queue line, only the intensity preference check that involves the happiness is activated, which again succeeds and allows them to go on the ride. This shows that for guests just randomly stumbling upon the ride, there is no sudden penalty to the ridership when you reach 10 intensity. Well, technically there is, I guess, if all your guests have 0 happiness, but if that's the case then you have bigger problems, my friend. However, for the guests that specifically head for the ride, which is a significant portion usually, there is that penalty at 10 intensity, so it's still a good idea to keep it below that. Although interestingly, this threshold is ever so slightly different from the other penalty you get for extreme intensity ratings. When the intensity reaches 10.00, it turns red and you lose a quarter of the excitement rating. But guests heading for the ride will still ride it at this point. It's not until 10.01 that they now refuse to do this. But for the sake of making it easy, just keep it below 10, okay? That will make sure there are no penalties in any shape or form. This all still doesn't explain how David Beckham was able to ride a super intense ride while preferring rides with less than 3 intensity. I did that by advertising. When you advertise a ride or give coupons for a free ride ticket, guests generated from those ad campaigns will immediately start heading for that ride once they enter the park. This allows them to skip the preference check and only do the check of whether the ride intensity is under 10 once they reach the queue line. There is another way to skip the intensity and nausea checks, and that is with rain. If it rains and the ride is sheltered, then guests will ignore the intensity and nausea ratings and always go on the ride in order to get out of the rain. This allows guests to go on any ride with any intensity and nausea rating as long as it's sheltered, even something completely ridiculous like 69.69. However, there is still that same check for under 10 intensity when guests specifically heading for the ride encounter the queue line, so this only works for guests randomly stumbling upon the ride. Before we move on to the next section, let's summarize what we've learned so far. Guests have different intensity and nausea preferences, which are used to check whether they should go on a ride. These ranges are extended by the happiness of the guest, allowing them to stray up to 2.55 points outside of that range and even go quite a bit above 10 intensity and nausea. However, guests specifically heading for a ride will not go on it if the intensity is above 10, so keeping it below that is still a very good idea. Now that we know how that works, let's have a look at the distribution of preferences among the guests and after that how they can change over time. When a guest spawns, it will randomly be assigned an intensity preference and a nausea tolerance. There are 5 different possibilities for the intensity preference: less than 3, between 1 and 4, between 2 and 5, between 3 and 6, and more than 4. The last one, more than 4, has a 50% chance of being picked, while the others all have just a 12.5% chance. So right off the bat, already half of your guests will ride all your big intense roller coasters as long as those coasters stay under 10 intensity. For nausea tolerances there is a different distribution. None has a 12.5% chance, low and high have a 25% chance, and average is the most common with 37.5%. If the guests are quite happy, let's say 180 out of 255, then even a low nausea tolerance already lets them go on rides with up to 7.8 nausea, which is almost all rides. It's really only that 12.5% of the guests with no nausea tolerance at all that are likely to not go on rides because they're too sickening. Interestingly, the intensity preference and nausea tolerance are completely independent from each other. A guest with a low intensity preference of less than 3 can still have a high nausea tolerance and the other way around. But of course it gets more complicated still. There are scenarios like Gentle Glen where all the guests prefer less intense rides. If this is the case, then everyone will have their preference set to 4 or less, no matter what, and this cannot ever change. With a lot of happiness, this can be extended up to 6.55, but in these parks guests will never ever, outside of advertising and rain, ride rides with a higher intensity rating than 6.55. The nausea tolerances are still distributed as usual, so guests will still go on nauseating rides and won't always get extremely sick from them. Considering that most guests are at least neutrally happy most of the time, you can safely build ridehood up to about 5.5 intensity in these parks without needing to worry about them being too intense. There's also the opposite. In scenarios like extreme height, guests prefer more intense rides. This gives everyone the unique preference of more than 9. Whereas the less than 4 from gentle loving parks is possible to get under normal circumstances as well, this more than 9 is completely unique to parks where guests prefer more intense rides. This too is extended by the guest happiness down to a possible 6.45 intensity. But to be on the safe side and also accommodate people that do not have a smile from ear to ear, a minimum of about 7.5 is probably a good idea. In these parks, the nausea tolerances are different as well. If a guest had a nausea tolerance of none here, then before the happiness calculations they would only want to go on rides with both over 9 intensity and under 3 nausea, which is pretty much non-existent and maybe even impossible. Therefore, in these scenarios, 75% of the guests will have a high nausea tolerance, so up to 10, and the other 25% have an average nausea tolerance, which is up to 8 nausea. With the distributions all discussed, we have now arrived at the question that inspired me to make this video. How do these preferences change over time? The nausea tolerance is set in stone and will never change, but the intensity preference will increase as the guest goes on more rides and builds up the courage to go on even scarier ones. There are only 5 possible ranges for guests to spawn with, but if you click on some guests in a random park, then you can see all kinds of different ranges, such as less than 11, between 2 and 9, between 1 and 5, and also still the good old more than 4. These can happen because every time the guest goes on a ride, there is a certain chance that the maximum of their preferred intensity range will increase by 1. So Professor Oak, who has a preference of less than 11, started out with less than 3 and had it increase 8 times. Elm started with between 2 and 5 and has had 4 increases, Birch started with between 1 and 4 with 1 increase, and Rowan's more than 4 never changed as it already is the highest maximum possible. This increasing will continue until the maximum of 15 is reached. The less than 3 starting preference will go through all the numbers and end up at less than 15 eventually. The other ranges will at the very end change from saying between 1, 2 or 3 and 14 to more than 1, 2 or 3. Half the guests already start with more than 4, which, just like what we just saw, is in reality between 4 and 15. As I mentioned before, this upper ceiling of 15 intensity is completely useless as this gets capped to 10 before applying the happiness extension anyway. So in practice, once a guest has reached a range of between some number and 10 or less than 10, there are no more changes to which rides they will go on, even if the numbers do keep going up for a little bit longer. Oh, and all of this does not work in parks where guests prefer gentle rides. That less than 4 that they all spawn with here is completely locked in and unchangeable. Technically, there is no code preventing an increase in parks where guests prefer more intense rides, but their more than 9 actually means between 9 and 15, so it's already at the maximum anyway. For the longest time, I thought that this increase in intensity would happen if a guest rode a ride that had a really high intensity rating compared to their preference, such as a guest with between 2 and 5 going on a ride with 6 intensity. This would make sense as building up to something bigger is usually done by slowly going a little bit more intense every time, but that's not how it works here. In reality it is, for once, well, kind of depending how you look at it, but I think it is, less complicated. First, the guest needs to have at least 200 out of 255 happiness. If they have a beaming smile, they always are happy enough, and the next level down corresponds to a happiness range of 185 to 221, so guests with this face will be happy enough a little bit over half the time. Then a random number between 0 and 255 is generated, and if that number is equal to or higher than the guest's intensity value, the maximum will increase by 1 point. This intensity value is calculated by taking their maximum intensity preference multiplied by 16 and adding their minimum intensity preference. For example, if a guest has a preference of between 2 and 5, their intensity value here will be 5 times 16 plus 2, which is 82. The chance that a random number ranging from 0 to 255 is larger than 82 is 68%. So, after riding any ride, no matter the stats of the ride or how much they enjoyed it, a guest with an intensity range of between 2 and 5 has a 68% chance of this range increasing to between 2 and 6. They now have a higher intensity value of 98, so the chance that it increases to between 2 and 7 when they ride another ride is a little bit lower at 61.7%. You can calculate this chance for any possible intensity range, and here are all those chances. These represent all the possible ranges that can still change and their corresponding chance that they will do so after riding a ride. At first it will increase most of the time, but as the maximum intensity preference increases it goes slower and slower until the chance is just barely over 10%. A guest that starts with the lowest range of less than 3 needs to write on average 14.3 rights before they reach the highest useful range of less than 10. For the other starting ranges this number is a bit lower as they start out higher and can skip their first few steps. To go all the way to the highest possible maximum preference of 15 intensity it takes an average of between 32.6 and 34.9 rights depending on where they start. If you keep your guests happy and the intensity ratings of your rides below 10, then guests will already ride everything when their maximum intensity preference reaches just 8. This is on average already reached in less than 10 rides, no matter what they start with. Well, not every guest will ride everything in the end, as the guests that start with a minimum of 3 or 4 intensity will never go on a ride with less than 0.45 and 1.45 intensity respectively. Except of course for when it rains and the ride is sheltered, or if they were forced to head for the ride by advertising. And there is of course also still the nausea preferences, which cannot change. More than half of the guests will ride pretty much any nausea rating, and even the ones with a low nausea tolerance can go over 8 nausea if they're really happy. But that 12.5% with no tolerance at all will never ever go on any rides with more than 5.55 nausea, although again with exceptions for rain and advertising. In summary, guests all have a certain intensity preference and nausea tolerance, which determines which rides they can ride. The happier they are, the further they are willing to stray outside of those ranges, up to a maximum of 2.55 points. Guests spawn with one of 5 possible intensity preference ranges and one of 4 possible nausea tolerances. Their maximum intensity preference has a chance to increase by 1 point when they finish riding a ride and are happy enough, up to a maximum of 15. Exceptions though are parks where guests only prefer gentle or only prefer more intense rides, where every guest has a preference of less than 4 and more than 9 respectively, and these cannot ever change. Even though their intensity preference range can go well beyond 10 intensity, it's still a good idea to keep your rides below that, as otherwise a different intensity check will still turn away guests that are specifically heading for the ride once they encounter the queue line. Lastly, rain will allow guests to go on any ride with any intensity and nausea rating as long as the ride is sheltered. And that's it. I hope that all of you who were confused after my remark in the previous video have it all cleared up now. If you want to learn more about guest behavior, click here to learn all about their pathfinding. Thank you all for watching and I will see you in the next video.